Huddle up. It's me, Angel Reese. You can't beat the post-game burger and fries, right? Know what else you can't beat? The Angel Reese Special. Let's break it down. My favorite barbecue sauce, American cheese, crispy bacon, pickles, onions, and a sesame seed bun, of course. And don't forget the fries and a drink. It's gonna be a high C for me. Sound good? All you have to do to get it is beat me in a one-on-one. I'm just playing. Get the Angel Reese Special at McDonald's now. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
It is Monday, February 10th, 2025. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen, the sports podcast here at Slate. Back with you again. I'm Alex Kirshner. I'm a contributing writer for Slate, and I also co-host the college football podcast Split Zone Duo. Super Bowl 59 has come and gone. It was, certainly a football game with at least one team playing on the field at all times. We will discuss the flight of the Philadelphia Eagles. Also, we will talk about Donald Trump's executive order targeting trans athletes, a segment for which we'll have an excellent guest, sports writer and editor Julie Kliegman, joining us for that. And we'll discuss the continuing efforts of various sports executives to make their games shorter. They have some good ideas, and they have some bad ideas. As usual, joining me this week is Lindsay Gibbs, the publisher of Power Plays, a newsletter that covers the biggest stories of the day in women's sports. Lindsay, how are you?
Well, I'm doing better than Mark Williams, who was sent to the Lakers and then sent back to the Hornets because he failed his physical. So that's been my favorite subplot of the week. And man, what a weird locker room scenario.
We're all doing better than Anthony Davis, at least. No adductor issues here.
We can only hope that he at least got some frequent flyer miles out of the deal, going from one city to the other and then back. And of course, we've got Ben Lindbergh here. Ben is a senior editor for The Ringer. He co-hosts Effectively Wild, a baseball podcast, which is now into season preview season. The Boys of Summer.
That's right.
Coming right around the corner. Ben, how are you?
Yeah, pitchers and catchers report this week. I'm bummed that the entire internet beat me to the Tommy Tuberville Patrick Mahomes joke I was planning to make here, but that's what we get for being Monday morning podcasters. Got to come up with fresh material.
Before we get into our business, we want to talk about the time that we recruited Patrick Mahomes to Texas Tech, which we did. You can just look it up. We were as involved in that recruitment process as the senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, was, as he described to numerous media outlets of late. But also, before we get into our business, as always, we want to say thank you to our Slate Plus members for making our show possible. The Hang Up and Listen love language for our subscribers is a bonus episode. And this week's is in members' podcast feeds right now about the NFL offseason ahead. You can hear that right now as long as you're a Slate Plus member. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. Super Bowl 59 was certainly something. It was a 40-22 final score for the Eagles over the Chiefs, denying Kansas City a three-peat and bringing the Lombardi Trophy back to Eastern Pennsylvania for the second time. Second time since 2018. Good things come in pairs, come pretty quickly for the Philadelphia Eagles. Really, that 18-point margin doesn't tell the story. The Eagles were dominant all night. Chiefs scored some points in garbage time. The offensive line got totally caved in by the Eagles' defensive front, which didn't blitz all night, but still just threw the offensive lineman backwards. Patrick Mahomes was shockingly bad. Not that he had many chances to do anything without people flying at him like rockets. Lindsay, wow, right?
Wow. I have to say, this is probably the most fun I've ever had watching a Super Bowl blowout. A few weeks ago, I really didn't think I would have had a really strong preference in this game, but I think over the last couple of weeks, there's a lot going on in our country, and it seemed like one team, to oversimplify things, was being embraced by a leader who decided to come to the game and try and make it all about him. And the other team was less excited. At least the leaders of that team were less excited about that presence. And when you don't have history with either team, that became a really strong pull for me. So it really felt nice to watch, which just sounds horrible. It sounds horrible, but to watch Patrick Mahomes get sacked over and over again and just look completely helpless, because we've seen him look otherworldly in these situations so often. And yeah, Jalen Hurts, on the other hand, seeing him get his moment to shine, I had a blast. I don't know what that says about me, but listen, it's been a rough stretch.
Yeah, I think regardless of political leanings, really across all sides of the aisle, this is a bipartisan issue that probably a lot of football fans were ready for Patrick Mahomes to be beaten in another Super Bowl, and that happened quite convincingly here. Our stewardship of Hang Up and Listen spanned this entire NFL season, and how many times did we talk about the Chiefs and how they couldn't be beaten in close games and they can't keep getting away with this? And one way to avoid losing to the Chiefs in a close game is not to play one, is just to blow them out. And 24-zip at halftime, 34-0 in the third. Again, maybe you could say that Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs won the fourth quarter here, as they so often do. But this time, that didn't matter at all, because this game was well out of hand. So, yeah, I think it was kind of a coronation for Hurts, in the sense that maybe he just wasn't getting mentioned quite as much as Mahomes and Lamar and Josh Allen and all the other just superb quarterbacks in these playoffs. And maybe he's not the best at anything, but he's good at everything. And he did exactly what he needed to do here. This wasn't a big game for Saquon. Really, the one thing that the Chiefs did well was to stop the Eagles' running game. But that didn't help them, because Hurts and Brown and the rest of the passing game were just firing on all cylinders. And football's best defense looked like football's best defense. 6 sacks of Patrick Mahomes. They were just all over him from the get-go.
It's funny because 2 years ago, the Eagles team that lost to the Chiefs in the Super Bowl nearly set the record for the most sacks in an NFL season. They wound up with right about 70, almost on the dot, maybe on the dot. A couple of places count sacks differently. That's why I hedge a little bit as I say that. That was a legendary pass rushing unit. This year's Eagles defense was not quite that prolific. They didn't have a single double-digit sack player on the team. Their numbers in terms of actually putting the quarterback on his back were fairly normal, but they generated, I think, a lot of interior pressure all season. I think the reason that they did that, and interior pressure doesn't always lead to sacks because it's harder to get around centers and guards than it is tackles, is that they have Jalen Carter now, this second-year defensive tackle from Georgia, who is just a complete force of nature in this game, going up against an all-pro, a first-team all-pro center, Creed Humphrey for the Chiefs. And Carter just kind of ragdolled this player for roughly 60 minutes of this game. Joe Thuney, the guard tackle swingman, who's also a first-team All-Pro, like, again, not a chump here, just got thrown backwards by Josh Sweat, the defensive end for the Eagles, who on one play basically heaved Thuney into Patrick Mahomes to facilitate his second interception of the game, which, by the way, was caught by a middle linebacker, Zach Bond, who was kind of a scrap heap pickup in a way, and has become an All-Pro for the Philadelphia Eagles. Just such an impressive show of best beating best decisively in this game, like taking supposed strengths of the Chiefs and just making them look awful, like small children who didn't belong on the field. I think pound for pound, it might be the best Super Bowl performance, certainly that I've seen in my 30 years or so of being on this earth, maybe 26, 27 of which I've been cogent.
Wow. You were really with it 3-year-old, Alex. That's
Yeah, really.
I was.
Yeah.
I was charting formations, things like that. Yeah.
A lot of pounds on that Eagles line, speaking of pound for pound, which is probably part of it. But there was plenty of protection for Hurts, and there was not much protection for Mahomes, but I don't think that tells the whole story. This just was not a good game for Mahomes, even just taking the defense out of it. I mean, this was his worst game of his career by EPA, and by dropback success rate, second worst by QBR. And maybe that's really the difference between this Super Bowl loss and the last one in 2021 to the Bucs and Brady, is that in that case, Mahomes didn't have a lot of protection, but he still made a bunch of incredible plays. And if anything, he came out of that game looking pretty good. It wasn't so much that he choked, it's that he was trying to make the best of bad circumstances, and he still came up with some signature plays. This time, it just wasn't that. He looked uncomfortable the entire game. He just had some sequences, like in the second quarter when the Eagles just put this game away. There were 3 possessions where he was sacked 3 times and then picked off twice, and it was just disastrous, right? All the turnovers, one of them which gave the Eagles very favorable field position and enabled them to essentially seal this game. So it reflected pretty poorly on him, and I guess he's entitled to one bad game after all the good big games. It's almost like we were all forecasting regression for the Chiefs and all these close games that they managed to win, and they aren't actually this good, and the record doesn't reflect how they actually played. And it's as if all of that caught up to them in a single game. Just all the good luck, all the pulling out wins and adverse circumstances, just all of that deserted them, and it kind of caught up to them all at once in the wrong time for that to happen. So they sort of reinvented their offensive attack after that previous Super Bowl loss. We'll see if Mahomes and Andy Reid can go back to the drawing board and do it again.
Yeah, I feel like we need to go over just a couple of first half stats to really describe. They're stunning. I watched it and these stats are still stunning. Yards in the first half, 179 to the Eagles, 23 to the Chiefs. The Eagles had more points than the Chiefs had yards. You also had first downs, 13 for Philly and 1 for Kansas City. Kansas City did not cross midfield until the Eagles led 34-0 in the third quarter. They did not cross midfield. And like I said, I'm stunned by these stats, but watching it, it did look just that bad. Like, I do feel like there was a little bit of a cloud hanging over watching the first half because you did expect Patrick Mahomes to come back, and you have Tom Brady commentating on it, who, of course, I mean, we all felt the hope on that 24-3 lead in the Falcons versus Patriots Super Bowl. So, there was a little bit of holding the breath, but the destruction just continued in the third quarter, and then it was over.
It was, for a while, very intuitive, I think, to think that something would happen just because Mahomes was on the other side. Like, I remember remarking to some friends that I was watching with that 17-0 didn't feel over, but 24 pretty much does, even though the 28-3 Patriots comeback over the Falcons did happen, and we all saw it. And, the striking thing to me was the way that it never even began to look like a collapse might be coming. There was not a single explosive completion by the Chiefs that made you think, oh, here they come on the march, until it was after 34-0 and things were really well and truly over. Ben, I think you get to it when you talk about Patrick Mahomes, because he was just independently terrible in this game. The misses on plays when he had opportunities. Look, I hate to sports television this, but if he'd have won this third in a row, it would have been a massive, not legacy defining, but certainly legacy aiding thing. I do think that him getting blown out like this is going to be, again, not legacy defining. He's out, his bust in Canton is secured, but this is going to be remembered, isn't it, as the biggest ass kicking on the biggest stage that any quarterback of repute has ever taken in football? I think it has to be.
Yeah, maybe so. I don't know. Could you sense any relief in Tom Brady's voice as he's calling this game about Mahomes not nipping at his heels quite so much in the GOAT conversation?
You certainly couldn't see it on his face because expressions are hard these days.
Yeah, that's a separate segment probably, but something's going on there. But yes, there's 5 Super Bowls in 7 seasons and winning 3 of them. He's obviously one of the greatest ever and the defining quarterback of this era. But yeah, he kind of crapped the bed in this game. It was really bad. And, how much did we talk about Spags and blitzing and just all this defensive brilliance and scheming on the part of the Chiefs? And I guess we should have been talking about Vic Fangio on the Eagles end. And it wasn't as if they did something super exotic or, they cracked the code. They did something that no one expected them to do. They didn't blitz at all. It was just that the Eagles had an answer for everything that the Chiefs tried to do. They were just better and bigger and faster, stronger, seemingly at every position. And, I'm kind of glad that it was as convincing as it was one way or another, because at least we could, for one game, retire the Chiefs referee bias kind of conversation. I don't know how many people wrote their version of that study on whether the Chiefs actually get some kind of advantage, including Roger Sherman at the Ringer. But there was that one play on the first drive of the game, pass interference on that deep ball to Brown. And I know everyone was groaning seeing that immediately out of the gate and thinking, oh, here we go again. But that ended up not being a story at all. And in fact, the Chiefs had a number of kind of controversial penalties called on them. But when you have a blowout like this, and again, the final score doesn't fully reflect how lopsided this game felt, then no one's going to complain that much about officiating.
I feel like I get bonus points for waiting this long to mention the name Serena Williams, who just absolutely cameo of the year in that halftime performance. And Kendrick killed it. And the good thing about it being a blowout game is that in addition to the coordination of this Eagles team and really the greatness of team is that I think Kendrick Lamar's halftime performance will get plenty of run, and it upset the right people, I believe. So I'm bringing out Serena, just genius.
Yes, Drake also had a bad game. It was a divisive performance, I guess, because maybe it wasn't quite the spectacle that people expect from a Super Bowl halftime performance, or sort of a greatest hits, play the hits kind of performance. But, it was, I think, one that made you maybe respect Kendrick even more as an artist, because he stuck to his guns and, told a story as he said he was going to do. And that certainly wasn't a story that everyone was interested in hearing. But I wonder whether that means that the next Super Bowl we go back to something super safe. We just have someone dancing and doing wardrobe changes and pyrotechnics, and someone who's not going to annoy anyone watching that performance. But yeah, that was notable too. Brady's performance, I think, was fine. Like, there just wasn't that much to say about it, really. I kind of lamented just how much, you have Tom Brady in a Super Bowl, and obviously he's going to talk about his many Super Bowl performances, and you're going to have people bringing up his highs and his lows. That kind of becomes, part of the story of the broadcast, where it's just like, hey, you had your day. You had so many Super Bowls. We don't have to make this one about you too. But his actual commentating was perfectly fine and inoffensive. I thought not super insightful, but also not something that would lead to a lot of condemnation. So he did okay his first time out.
I thought that Tom Brady in general was a disappointment this season. I say disappointment even though I wasn't expecting a ton. I don't think he was brought onto this number one booth at Fox because anyone thought he was an incredible announcer. And of course, there's been a lot of ink spilled about how his real job at Fox is a bit more ambassadorial. It's to shake hands, to close sponsors, to be Tom Brady for most of the year, and not necessarily just for those 3 hours that we see him on Sundays. But Tom, I will extend the offer. If you want to get some reps in the offseason, I've seen you on the radio with Colin Cowherd. I've heard you on the radio. You sound very comfortable in those environments.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you on Hang Up over the offseason if you want to talk a little bit about the draft, the combine, free agency, etc.
Who had the more impressive turnaround from job being in danger to conquering hero, Ryan Day or Nick Sirianni?
This was on my mind too. Incredible year for guys who looked like the most doomed failures around. And then within a few weeks made themselves champions. Very impressive stuff for both Ryan Day and Nick Sirianni. And I'm sure that there are a lot of Eagles fans who have found his address and shared it amongst themselves, who are deleting it from their phones in a gesture of love towards their Super Bowl winning coach. Up next, the Trump administration stepped up its attacks on trans Americans over the past few weeks, and that has escalated into sports. We will talk about it. If there's one thing sports fans love as much as watching games, it's talking about them, especially the stats. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
There are some things you wouldn't mind being stuck with, like a large unexpected inheritance. An always on the verge of death phone that has to be plugged in just right so it charges is not one of those things. Switch to Verizon and we'll pay off your old phone. Up to $800 via prepaid MasterCard so you can get a new one. Just trade in any phone from our top brands on any unlimited plan. With new line on My Plan. Additional terms apply for trade-in and pay off your phone offer. See Verizon.com for details.
Last Wednesday, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that most specifically targets trans athletes, but in my view, taken in context, is an escalation of Trump and his ideological friends' effort to erase trans people from public life wherever they can. Trans women in sports, whom Republicans have taken to labeling only as biological males with apparent effectiveness in shaping public opinion, have been a particular fixation, and indeed, Trump saved this action for National Girls and Women in Sports Day. In front of risers packed with women and girls, Trump read off successful and sometimes hard to verify or untrue results achieved by trans women whom he called men, often to raucous laughter. He even misgendered an Algerian boxer at last year's Olympics who is not trans or a man. The thrust of the executive order is to deny federal funding and find Title IX violations at schools that allow trans women and girls to play in women's sports. This is an attempt at a blanket ban of all trans women and girls from these competitions, with no regard to when they transitioned or if there's any scientific basis to the notion that they might have some kind of advantage. The NCAA, for its part, quickly announced that it would ban trans women from women's competitions, falling in line with Trump's executive order. We have a great guest with us now to talk more about what's happening here and to help us put it into historical context. Julie Kliegman is a freelance writer and editor with a long history in sports media and an exciting project in the works right now. Next year, they will be out with a biography on Renee Richards, a trans tennis star who mounted a successful lawsuit to compete against women in the 1977 U.S. Open. Julie, how did trans inclusion in sports go backwards since Renee Richards 48 years ago?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Alex, and everyone. So I've been asking myself the question you just asked me quite often as I'm working on this biography of Renee Richards. And it really is kind of mind-boggling that we've fallen so far. I think one of the reasons now is that we've seen a much more coordinated attack on trans people in the last decade or so, especially since the gay marriage question was settled, at least for the moment, I guess I should say. And they've been ramping up these attacks for years. Conservatives have been, even some liberals, to be honest. And what we're seeing now is that the trans bathroom bills didn't really take off, right? Originally, you saw the NCAA and the NBA and other organizations and entertainers pull out events from North Carolina back when that first bathroom bill was passed. And so that was kind of like a trial balloon that didn't go too well. And then in Idaho in 2020, you see the first state successfully pass a ban on trans athletes in publicly funded school sports. And then from there, it's just kind of snowballed, right? And there's so much disinformation floating around about transgender people and trans athletes specifically, and so much bigotry out there that, you know, I think the attack is coordinated and there's a lot less confusion and like a less of a surprise factor than there was when Renee Richards was competing. And so people are like ready to take on this issue now in a way they weren't necessarily familiar with the talking points when Renee Richards came along.
Do you see this as an outgrowth of the larger anti-trans project, or do you see it as a driver, really, now that it's become this wedge issue that people seemingly respond to when they might not be so responsive to some other manifestation of that ideology?
I do see it as a driver. It's the area that we've seen the most success in, and that's led to these bills and executive orders now in these other areas, like against gender affirming care for teenagers. So I think everyone has some connection to sports, right? Whether they played them growing up, whether they watch them on TV, whether their children play them. So it's a pretty emotional issue, and it's one that naturally raises questions of fairness and equity, and everyone has some sort of opinion on it. And a lot of people, at least as far as polling shows, do not necessarily think that trans women have a place in sports.
I mean, in my opinion, a lot of that is because of how the Democrats have been so afraid of this issue. They've let the Republicans take the lead in the framing of this. They've said, well, this is uncomfortable. Let's try to ignore this. And there's been so little education and so little pushing back and so little defending of trans people. And I think that I get that the phrase of men and women's sports is an evocative one and one that people can use. It goes really well in a headline, in a title of an executive order, in a political ad. But it doesn't take much to say, hey, there are and have been longstanding guidelines in place and pathways to participation for transgender athletes at the elite levels. Majority of these bills are talking about youth sports, and in youth sports, the opportunity, the things that go through our government, this is such a small percentage of people, and it really should, the emphasis should be on letting everyone have a place on the field or the bench or wherever they, want to be, and on, inclusivity. And that the majority of these conversations, if we want to have an in-depth conversation about what exactly the policy should be for how many years on hormones or whatever for participation in the Olympics, that's a different conversation than the ones that are just this blanket ban. And I think I'm really disappointed in the way I feel like the Democrats have just ceded this issue entirely, hoped it would go away. And now here we are. It's National Women and Girls in Sports Day. And I've been covering the stunts on this day for as long as Power Plays has existed. And last Wednesday, we had another one, except this is the massive one. I mean, this is the one. And I'm curious, Julie, how you feel like this is enforceable and what impact this will have, because so many of the executive orders we don't know right now. And I got to mention, it's quite funny is the wrong word, but I think you all will know what I mean, that in this order, so much of it is that the Department of Education is in charge of investigating all claims that any transgender athlete is playing. But at the same time, Trump is trying to abolish the Department of Education. So
yeah, you raised a lot of really good points, Lindsay. And I just want to echo the fact that Democrats haven't done anything on this. They've been so scared and so willing to throw trans people under the bus since the moment they lost the election. But yeah, as far as enforceability, I think a lot remains to be seen. But we do know that Title IX investigations in general are not super, super effective. Like, we all know that, like, there's not equal opportunities for men and women in college sports, for example. But do those universities actually get investigated, and are there real consequences? Traditionally not. So I wonder if we could expect more of the same here. But at the same time, like, there is this heightened focus on, like, every trans athlete, like Leah Thomas or the volleyball player from this past season, they become lightning rods. And so because of the publicity surrounding those cases on the margins, it might be a different story than just a usual Title IX violation.
Julie, I have a question about the path forward here. I think all of us on this program, whether here on Hang Up or I've written about it for Slate, are of a somewhat similar mind about the bad faith behind this campaign that's been unfolding for years, and the lack of necessity of a blunt object like a blanket ban when there are so many different types of trans athletes at so many different junctures of their transition or of their careers that there can't possibly be a one-size-fits-all answer that would make any sense for this in the way that proponents of a ban have prescribed. And yet it does feel like this has sort of become the default common sense, the way to fight our woke lunacy, as the president put it at this signing ceremony. And, in the spirit of reckoning with this shift in public opinion, seemingly going the way of the people mounting this campaign, I wonder how you would deal with it and try to argue back that this kind of thing is not necessary or compassionate or effective or conducive to protecting women's sports or any of it.
That's such a great question, and I wish I had a straightforward answer. But one of the things we need to keep in mind is that when people know trans people personally, they become less hateful. I think that's pretty clear over the course of years and different research. So I think centering the humanity of people as opposed to focusing on the science of well, they have this disadvantage in terms of max O2 levels, but this advantage in this other area. I don't think that's going to be the argument that persuades anybody. I think it's all about humanizing trans athletes, as the humans they are. And then I think you need to see organizations like the IOC and the NCAA step up. And I mean, I don't necessarily think they will meet this moment, especially the NCAA.
Yeah.
Which, through my reporting, as I had in the spring at the Washington Post with Jesse Doherty, we were pretty sure that they were on the verge of instituting a ban like this in the NCAA. And so you can't really count on these big actors to do the right thing. The IOC has tried, certainly. They've gone to a sport-by-sport approach, right? Where the international sporting federations for any given sport can set their own policies. And they were kind of well, we encourage people to err on the side of inclusion. And I mean, that hasn't worked, right? World Athletics, which governs track and field, has put out a ban. Swimming, in light of Leah Thomas, that group's name is World Aquatics, they've put out a ban. And there are other bans like that. And so the IOC essentially lost control of this issue. And I wonder how these groups can even start to fight back, or if they even care to fight back. I mean, I think it's going to be a really long road back to trans athletes participating, especially trans women.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the strategies we're discussing have already been co-opted by the opponents, in the sense that you could say center the humanity of the trans competitors. Well, people on the other side have centered the humanity of the non-trans female competitors, and they have willing spokespeople, whether sincerely or for clout, who've kind of become the faces of that movement. Or you could frame it as fairness to trans women. Shouldn't they be allowed to compete? The other side has framed it as fairness to the non-trans female competitors. Well, shouldn't there be a level playing field? Or you could say, but it's so rare, there are so few who actually meet these conditions that we're talking about, but that doesn't really seem persuasive to people either, apparently, because it's less about how many there are than, I guess, the inherent fairness as people see it. You'd think that the number of people this applies to would shape the priority, but of course it's become this wedge issue, as we said. So we've been alluding to the effectiveness in shaping opinion and also persuading the left to just stay off the field. And just to cite some numbers on that, there was a New York Times Ipsos poll from last month where 79% of respondents, including 67% of Democrats, said that trans female athletes should not be allowed to compete in women's sports. In a 2023 Gallup poll, that percentage was 69%, up from 62% in a 2021 Gallup poll. So not moving toward greater acceptance, as we've said. So it's a thorny question to decide, how do you go about pushing public opinion back the other way? Or failing that, is there some solution that could find widespread support in the current climate? Or does that then become about, well, compromising with prejudice, because there is a right or wrong here?
There's a lot of people on the left, including trans people on the left, who think that sports is not an arena that's worth fighting in when it comes to trans rights. And I think that's such a mistake, actually, because it's not like if you compromise with conservatives on sports and give them this one thing, they're going to be like, never mind, we'll back off gender affirming healthcare. Like, they're going to take every inch they're given and then some.
It's true. And it's worth noting that this executive order comes on the heels of a broad-based executive attack on trans inclusion throughout government as well, just in the last couple of days before this was signed.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note, like, his executive orders against trans people have been even more horrifying than I was expecting, and that says a lot, because it's not just that he came out right out of the gate trying to basically erase transgender people from existence, from all forms, from all documents, from all verbiage, you know, saying it's just male and female that we recognize. But he's, you know, in his executive orders, he's defining transgender women basically as predators, saying, like, we have to keep them out of the showers. They're putting women in harm's way. In trying to get trans people out of the military, he is calling transgender people basically mentally ill and unfit, saying just the very being of being transgender means you are not a moral, upstanding person and cannot serve in the military. I mean, these are just, it's beyond dehumanizing. And it makes me so angry at every single, Julie and I have talked about this a lot, that there are these prominent women in women's sports who have decided, like Martina Navratilova, who have decided that this is their issue. But that, you know, they don't hate trans people. It's just the sports. And what they've done is they've given credence to this entire hate campaign. And what really gets me is that the right doesn't actually really care about transgender people at all. Like, it is all goes back to trying to control women's bodies. They are just willing to kill all transgender people and get rid of all transgender people in their way. I mean, there is a word in the order that his first executive order against trans people that says there's just two genders. He says that sex begins at conception, which in its way means life begins at conception. And so he's putting in anti-abortion language into these executive orders.
Right. And I think it's also worth saying that, like, in addition to, you know, spreading all this stuff about trans people, and these people who agree with him, none of them are trying to protect women's sports or save women's sports. Like, they don't give a crap about cisgender women athletes or the WNBA or the NWSL or women in the Olympics. I mean, these are all sports and leagues that are rife with abuse, with bad actors, and there are plenty of ways to address problems in women's sports that conservatives show no interest in.
It's so funny that he said in this today, let's try and get woke lunacy out of women's sports. Women's sports only exist because of woke lunacy. Like, the very, like, core of women's sports is radical. Like, you cannot take the woke lunacy out of women's sports. I'm sorry. It just can't happen.
Yeah, it has become sort of a winning strategy to provide cover, kind of a fig leaf for inherent bigotry that is maybe difficult to state plainly, in the way that DEI is now just essentially a synonym for some slur that you can't say. And so you've come up with this kind of code word dog whistle that resonates with people. And the sports issue seems to be that to some extent for trans rights.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
I think people like to feel somewhat like moderates. People like to feel like they get it, like they really understand things. Like, yeah, I'm a passionate, bleeding heart liberal, but, you know, I believe in common sense. How could I not? And the way in which conservative culture warriors have been able to sort of launder this issue as being about men in women's sports is, I think, telling of that dynamic. Who wouldn't be opposed to men in women's sports? Everyone's opposed to men in women's sports. There are no women's sports leagues that say men come on in. Of course, there's another word, which is trans women, and that one isn't used because saying that trans women shouldn't be allowed into women's sports lends itself less to the other side seeming crazy.
Right.
On that note, there's a House bill going around that also would ban trans women in sports. It's worth noting it's a very short bill. It has no details, except that it does have a carve-out that says male practice players are allowed, still allowed to practice with women's teams, and that they will count towards Title IX regulations. So it literally gives men more protection than it does women.
That's such an incredible point. Of course, we're prioritizing the men's feelings and the men's livelihoods.
And skirting Title IX. Like, we're making sure that,
Right.
like, we can still, like, fudge Title IX.
Yeah, and, you know, to be clear, like, you mentioned that the bill doesn't have details in it. I mean, this is something we've seen since the 1930s, like, with regards to sex testing. And it's like, okay, well, what does protesting an athlete's sex look like? And what does the verification process look like? These people are not concerned with the details. They haven't thought it through. They don't know or care how these athletes feel about the process. And that's very deliberate.
Julie Kliegman, thank you for coming on the program. We will be looking out closely for this Renee Richards book out in 2026 with HarperCollins. We appreciate you lending us your expertise in these difficult circumstances.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, sports execs are up to their favorite thing, trying to make their games shorter. We'll talk about it. Alex Kirshner still here with you on Hang Up and Listen with my colleagues Lindsay Gibbs and Ben Lindbergh. We are in an era of short attention spans. Young people are very clear when they are surveyed about it that game length is an impediment to them paying attention to live sports at all, much less actually going to games. Baseball, a couple of years ago, made probably the most famous move in this direction, catering towards this group, adopting the pitch clock. And most people would say it's gone very well in its first few years. And now barely a month passes, I would say, without another big-time sports exec trying to be the hero for their sport and unlock shorter games in the way that Rob Manfred, on this very narrow issue, was able to make himself into baseball's hero. To boot, Ben, the PGA Tour is talking shot clock. The NBA commissioner is publicly flirting with the idea of going from 12-minute quarters to 10. I am completely sold on the golf shot clock, which was a good idea long before the new TGL started using one indoors. But 10-minute quarters? Have we gone too far with this woke lunacy?
Yeah. I am pro improving pace of play and shortening games via that method, much more so than what I would consider to be the lazier way to do it, which is just let's lop off some time, which was something that was discussed in baseball and to some degree still is prior to the pitch clock implementation. One proposal was let's just make the game 7 innings. During the pandemic shortened season, we did actually have some 7-inning doubleheaders, and there was some discussion of maybe games are too long. Who needs 9 innings? Let's just shorten them to 7. And I much prefer the way that they did it, which was let's just stick with 9, but make sure that those 9 go faster and are more entertaining as a result. So that would be my preferred way to handle these things. And basketball has already gone the clock route. Of course, basketball has multiple clocks. It has a game clock. It has a shot clock. If anything, baseball was following in basketball's lead when it implemented the pitch clock. So the equivalent maybe would be something like the Elam ending, which could potentially be an improvement to the end of basketball games as it is, which are slow and bogged down in penalties. This might be a better, fairer, more entertaining way to end games that would also shorten them. And maybe that would be kind of the equivalent of the zombie runner in baseball, except way better, because I am a staunch anti-zombie runner opponent.
I don't like when a game that has, or a league that has a lot of history makes changes that impact kind of how we look at stats and how we look at put things in historical context. And so for that reason, kind of that reason only, I'm against the 10-minute quarters. WNBA has 10-minute quarters. College basketball has 10-minute quarters. Every other bit of basketball other than the NBA has 10-minute quarters. So I'm I think 10-minute quarters are fine. WNBA games usually fit into a nice, tidy 2-hour window, and that's good. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but it would just mess up the stats too much. And so I think, can we get replays down? Can we make replays happen faster? Can we maybe have a couple fewer commercial breaks? Maybe one fewer commercial break? I know that's sacrilegious, but there are...
we can't.
Can we start games on time, right? Like if we advertise that the game starts at 7, ESPN, NBA, we don't need the game to start at 7:17, to tip off at 7:17. So I think there's so many things that leagues... I'm being very particular to the NBA right now, can do to speed things up before they make really giant changes to the structure of their sport. I agree with shot clocks. I think the serving clock in tennis was phenomenal, has done great things. And so, really for, doing things that help the viewers improve the viewership experience. But at a certain point, greed is going to have to come into play here. And maybe the NBA, before it does anything, needs to shorten the amount of games. I don't know.
Yeah, that's the sticking point, because if you're going to try to cram in more games, as leagues generally do in order to increase revenue, then they've got to get shorter, because we've talked so much about load management and about the workload on athletes and the wear and tear, just adding more and more games to a season, especially as strenuous as sports are these days. Basketball seems like a sport that could stand to have fewer games, certainly in its regular season, when many of them are largely meaningless, because you just don't need as many games in basketball as you do in, say, baseball to separate teams by true talent and decide which team deserves to win. But then, of course, there are always considerations about revenue, and does fewer games mean that you're going to make less money? Or does it not mean that, because it'll make each game higher stakes and more exciting, and so you'll get an increase in revenue with each given game? So basketball seems like it's ripe for shortening games. Baseball, too, potentially. I also worry about that statistical cross-era comparison issue, although I think that's manageable. In basketball, if you do some sort of per-minute comparisons, which people already do, there are already just so many changes over the decades that you already have to do a lot of era adjustment as it is, so it would change things, but we're already used to things changing so much. And in baseball, one reason why the pitch clock worked, I think, better than most people anticipated, people thought it was a fundamental attack on the nature of baseball. It's a sport without clocks, but that wasn't totally true, because there were already rules on the books that limited the time between pitches. They just weren't enforced. And baseball is still theoretically infinite. Really, the unit of time is not time, it's outs. And if you keep getting hits, you can extend the game as long as you want. But beyond that, it was not jarring to spectators because it was pitched as, we're going back in time. This is actually more familiar. This is like the baseball you used to know and love, because games have gotten longer. And so we are actually bringing it in line with historical standards. And so that's one way you can sell it to spectators who are wary of change, particularly in baseball. You say, no, this is not new and scary. This is actually old and comforting and familiar.
I think the great lesson that should be taken from baseball is that it's not about the total amount of time you lop off. It's about the way you improve the game itself that you're already tuning in for. Baseball has given us back about 30-ish minutes per game with the pitch clock, and that's significant. If you watch 100 games a year of your favorite team, start to finish, you just say 50 hours, and you can do a lot with 50 hours. I understand that. But what I've really enjoyed about it, and what I think most people seem to have really liked about it, is that the game just flows more, and it feels more watchable, like more of a breeze, less of a slog. I think that should point in the direction of shot clocks in golf being a pretty good idea, but you would never, you're not going to take an 18-hole golf format and suddenly say, the PGA Tour is now playing 14 holes. That will turn people off. That's not proper golf. Just like you didn't shorten the baseball games from 27 outs to 21. You can pretty easily, I think, get people behind the idea of, we're going to give you the same amount of like sporting joy and spectacle that you've gotten before, but we're going to waste less of your time doing it. And if you do it that way, you don't even have to lower your commercial load. I mean, baseball hasn't lowered its commercial load at all that I'm aware of. You still got commercials every inning break. Yeah, it doesn't feel like this has to be that hard. Now, basketball's issue is that it doesn't have a natural stopping point, every 3 outs in the same way that baseball does. But sometimes I do think that, this is a bit big brained. Like, this has been overcomplicated by executives who look to take the wrong lessons from something that was pretty simple when it was successfully done in baseball.
Yeah, I think one of the big benefits in baseball that's probably been underrated is the predictability of the length of the games now. It's not just that they're shorter, it's that you can count on how long they'll be in a way that you never could before. Because in baseball, you didn't know if you were going to get a 2-hour game or a 4-hour game. And now you can predict pretty accurately. They don't vary that much between the pitch clock and also the zombie runner starting an extra inning with a runner on second base. Much as I hate that, much as I think it's a travesty that distorts scoring and the rules, and they give the game away by shelving the zombie runner in the playoffs when the games are actually important and they say we can't decide games in this silly way. But those two things in tandem have made it so that you can go to a game and you can take your family, and even if it's a weekday and it's a work night or a school night, you can go and you can be pretty confident that you're not going to be there all night. Now, that doesn't map onto other sports quite as well because they do have game clocks and you can estimate with some reliability how long you're actually signing up for. But as we've talked about so many times, there are just so many competing entertainment options out there. And sports are always trying to just claw out their corner or protect their corner of the culture. And whether that's with alt casts or alt settings, as we've talked about, or it's just trying to keep up the pace so that you don't have people distracted and second screening or third screening or just tuning out your product, there is an impulse to just more inventory so that we can make more revenue. But also, we don't want to scare people away. So it's got to be shorter and quicker.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm very adamant about that should happen is a review clock. Reviews in all sports have gotten out of control. They take way too long. Often it's still a flip of a coin for these reviews after you're staring at it. If you have to stare at it for longer than 20 seconds, then it's kind of a flip of a coin judgment call anyways. And why not just stick with the call that was on the floor? So I feel like limiting reviews would really help all sports.
I agree. I also think that sports that take 2 steps in the direction of slower should not pat themselves on the back when they take 1 step in the direction of pacier. College football has seen a significant increase just over the last 10 or 15 years in the ad load that it fits into commercial breaks on games, I think across the networks for the most part, but particularly on ESPN's networks. There was some research that I did earlier this year to confirm that. And, college football's rules committee gets together before last season and they speed up the clock on certain first downs and certain times where players would go out of bounds. You might have stopped the clock before, but now you don't. And that's the kind of thing where, you're fighting the wrong battle. And, I'm not really interested in like tiny measures to make the game move a little bit faster when you're still breaking them up more and more via longer TV timeouts. I just think it comes down to respecting your audience. And I think people can sniff when a pace of play reform is meant to help them a bit, like make it easier to be a fan of the sport in the hope that you'll give more time and money to that sport. And when it's an effort to get away with greed. The two reveal themselves pretty clearly from time to time.
Yeah, and often you need leadership that will show some strength and stick with the courage of its convictions, because often there is a clearly effective solution that maybe is not politically palatable, or you worry about the blowback, and so it becomes, to quote Kylo Ren, I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I have the strength to do it. In baseball, there were a lot of just half measures, and we'll stop people from stepping out of the box, and we'll call violations on them, and they were barely enforced, and you'd gain a few minutes here, and then you'd lose several minutes the next season, and it was always clear that there was a better way to do this. It's not like a pitch timer was some new advanced technology that wasn't viable before. I've traced the history of that. It goes back to the 60s or 70s in baseball, where it was tested and just ultimately rejected because it was too much of a shock to the system. And MLB, to its credit, went about it the smart way, which is, let's do it slowly. Let's ease people into it. We'll test it in the minors and all these various amateur levels. And then by the time we implement it in the majors, a lot of the big leaguers will have already played with a pitch clock at some lower level, and so they won't object to it. And ultimately, they managed to sell it and make sure that when it was implemented, it went smoothly. So sometimes that's the way you have to do it just to overcome the objections. Fortunately, here at Hang Up, we have producer Kevin Bendis, our own timekeeping mechanism, who will chat us when a segment is going too long. So maybe that's something that the NBA should explore.
Kevin has not chatted us in regards to this segment. We are reaching the conclusion on our own. We have decided without any help at all that is all for this episode. We also have a special bonus show that is in the podcast feeds right now for our treasured Slate Plus subscribers. To hear that, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangup+ to get access wherever you listen. That is available right now. We will see you over there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup. You can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. For Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I'm Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelma Beatty, and thanks for listening. If there's one thing sports fans love as much as watching games, it's talking about them, especially the stats. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.